My name is Bruce Maccabee. I do physics research for the Navy. I've been involved in UFO research since the late 60s when I joined an organization that existed at that time called the National Investigating Committee on Aerial Phenomena. In the 74, 75, I became the Maryland State Director for MUFON and have been active in a fund for UFO research. I was the chairman of the Fund for UFO Research for 13 years. So I've been active in the field and memberships and organizations, and also doing case investigations since the late 60s. Well, I went to a college called Worcester Polytechnic Institute from 60 to 64 and got a BS in physics. Then I went to American University in Washington, D.C., got a master's and then a PhD in 1970. And I've been doing physics research for the Navy basically ever since. Well, having studied the historical record as well as doing sighting investigations and so on, it becomes clear to me that the government took a two-track approach. One was that the really good information was somehow bottled up, and the information that was released to the public was always with the intent of indicating that everything could be explained. And if you look through the Project Blue Book files, for example, you can find a number of sightings where the explanations don't make any sense in the context of the sighting. I don't think it's because the people who were doing the Project Blue Book investigations were stupid, but rather they had an agenda, which was to play this whole thing down as much as possible. So where the rubber meets the road in ufology is the answer to this question. Are there any sightings that can't be explained by conventional phenomena? If there were no such sightings, I wouldn't be here. And I'm sure most of the other people wouldn't be here either. It's when you find that there are some sightings which can't be explained by ordinary phenomena, except by assuming, for example, witnesses or test instruments or devices suddenly went crazy during the period of the sighting and then reverted to normalcy afterwards. We have stories of people whose cars were stopped by objects flying over, and then afterwards everything worked fine. If you could imagine that the witnesses themselves went crazy during that period of time and completely confabulated whatever their story is, and then reverted to normalcy, then maybe you can then explain things like some amazing sightings, although it gets tougher when you have multiple witnesses, because then you have to assume that all the witnesses went crazy at the same time and saw the same thing while they were crazy. Came up with the same story. Well, the bottom line is I don't believe the claim of the Air Force that all sightings can be explained. And I would point to some numbers. They're on my some of them are on my website, which can't be explained. And in some cases, you can actually point to where the Air Force explanation completely contradicts what's inside the sighting report itself. And so the question then is, given that if you accept, as I do, that there was some sort of a cover-up going on, why was that? Why not just let it all hang out? And I think essentially we're trapped in history that when the first evidence of ET visitation and hardware and so on came along, the U.S. government took the attitude that we couldn't release this to the general public because it had extreme implications for defense. That whoever has flying saucers wins, in a sense. And we don't want our enemies to know that we've got one, because then they might try to get one. So to the extent that we might be able to back engineer the technology, we don't want to tell somebody else that we're trying to do such a thing. So the government set up Project Blue Book, the Air Force did, in order to investigate this subject on you might say, a low level of looking at sighting reports and so on, but anything that involved absolute proof like hardware and bodies was siphoned off completely into another track. And we're still trying to penetrate what that track was, but some new information just published is going to open up another channel for us to pursue this problem of getting the information out into the open, I guess you could say. McMinnville, that was not a UFO crash. The McMinnville sighting had to do with 2 photographs taken by a farmer in 1950, which I was involved with because I took on that case because it was the only photographic case in the CONDON report in which the photographic analyst said that all things investigated seemed to point towards the idea that an extraordinary flying object had passed within the sight of 2 witnesses and they had taken a picture of it. This was sort of the only sighting endorsed by the photographic analyst of the University of Colorado study called the CONDON report. And I thought, well, that was interesting. Let's see if he was right. And I managed to get a hold of the original negatives. And that's a long story in itself. And then spent several years analyzing them. And I had them studied at Los Alamos National Laboratory and the Brooks Photographic Institute in Santa Barbara and a number of other places. Nobody could find any crucial proof that these things were hoaxes. But more than that, I spent time talking to the farmer's wife, Mrs. Trent. This is the Paul and Evelyn Trent sighting. They died in 1995, 96 and stuck to their story right to the end. You know, it's a simple story. This lady saw this object flying along through the sky while she was out in their backyard, called to her husband to come and look at it and bring the camera. And he runs outside and takes 2 pictures, which were, and then they had them developed, but they didn't tell anybody. And a boyfriend of one of their female relatives, it wasn't their daughter, but somebody else, happened to see these pictures and decided they were pretty good and wanted to take them to the local banker to find out if anybody knew what it was that they had photographed. The local banker put them up and put these 2 pictures in the window of the bank. This was in 1950, so flying saucer stories were around at that time. And the photographic editor of the local newspaper walked by the bank window, saw these pictures in the bank window, went in and talked to the banker, you know, where'd these come from? And he was told, you know, Farmer Paul Trent, very staid citizen, you know, nothing suspicious about him. These photos are probably real. So the photographic editor went to the farmhouse where the Trents lived, interviewed them, found that the negatives had somehow slipped down behind the sofa. The kids were playing with the negatives. Retrieved the negatives, went back to the newspaper. I spoke to this man directly. The photographic editor I talked to in 77 or 78. And he told me that he blew up these negatives every which way, trying to figure out how they could have hoaxed this. And having talked to the Trents, he decided it was impossible because they weren't smart enough to be able to think of something like this, right? So he published them in the newspaper. And that's when it began for the Trent case, and they're probably some of the most widely published photos ever in the history of the subject because they're so old, but also they're perfectly clear. It's either the real thing or a hoax. There's no halfway point. And of course, there were a lot of arguments that somebody had thrown a garbage can lid up in the sky and photographed it, or had a model hanging on a string. A lot of these arguments about the model making could be tackled to some extent from the physics of the photographs itself. In the CONDON study, the photo analyst went to the Trent farm, which had changed somewhat since the time of the photos. He didn't do his investigation until 67 or 68, some 17 or 18 years after the photos were taken. But he went to the Trent farm, found the place where the camera had been where the photographer had been standing, you know, took comparison shots. And anyway, he did a specific type of photometric analysis, the study of the relative brightnesses of things. And he concluded that the object was maybe a kilometer away. And if it were, then it was 30 feet in diameter and out far beyond any hoax. So that's why he said in the CONDON study report that he talked to the trench, and he says, yeah, well, it can't prove that it's not a hoax, but it certainly didn't seem to be consistent with everything else that was known about them. So that was published in 1968. And when I read through the CONDON report, a year or so later, I read through everything and saw that case and decided it would be interesting to try to duplicate it. But I didn't actually do anything on it until about 1974, I guess, when I began making efforts to get the negatives themselves. By this time, the noted skeptic Philip Klass had argued that the Trents had faked the whole thing. The stories that were published in the newspapers weren't totally consistent from one witness to the other. There's slight variations in the sequence of events and who did what. Of course, they were being interviewed. Their pictures weren't published until about a month after the photos were taken, and they were being interviewed after this time lag, So anyway, I actually called up Mrs. Trent, talked to her a number of times, got the hold of the negatives, did analysis and so on, and concluded ultimately that it couldn't be a hoax, because these people, it's completely out of character, shall we say, for these people to even think of such a thing, to say nothing of being able to pull it off, construct a photo. It's real easy to hang a model from a string or something like that, but to even think of something like that, and then maintain this story through the barrage of criticism that they received over the years. Like I said, their last interview was videotaped, I think, in 1994 or 5, just before they died. And they were still sticking to the same story. So I concluded that was real. And as I said, the photo was clear enough so that it's either the real thing or a hoax. There's no halfway point, and I conclude it's not a hoax. You mentioned the Gulf Breeze sightings, but before that, back in 1978, December 1978, the sightings off the coast of New Zealand. I was still working on the Trent case when this New Zealand thing came along, and the New Zealand case absorbed the next few years of my life. These investigations, when you're really careful and if they're rich with details, it's not something you do by reading a few things in a night and then write a book about it. 2 books were written about the New Zealand case by people who were involved at the time, and I've got some stuff on this on my website. I was able to get into a scientific journal, a technical journal called Applied Optics, a refereed journal. A short article about a calculation that I did of this object detected in New Zealand. The sighting occurred in the early morning of December 31st, 1978. Then within 24 hours, it was international news. Even Walter Cronkite on CBS used up the last 5 minutes of his good morning or his evening news show. I think on the 1st of January, or either the 1st or 2nd, I can't be sure what it was, but he was announcing it for the first time into the United States. That is the first official announcement by the press that these things had happened. It involved people flying on a four-engine jet, a four-engine propeller plane, a freighter, carrying newspapers in the middle of the night from Wellington, New Zealand, down to Christchurch. And then the plane flew back to its home base from Christchurch to Blenheim. Christchurch and Blenheim are both in the South Island of New Zealand. Wellington is at the southern tip of the North Island of New Zealand. And so this plane was off the coast, 20 miles off the coast of New Zealand most of the time during the sightings. And it just so happened that because of previous events, there was a news crew on board this aircraft, and complete with a 16mm professional color movie camera and somebody doing a tape recording. So what really makes the New Zealand sighting outstanding, even till today, more than 25 years afterwards, is that you have a tape recording made at the Wellington Air Traffic Control Center, which you can hear the pilots and you can hear the Air Traffic Control Center talking about the radar targets they got. And the tape recording on the airplane, that tells you what the reporter was seeing at the time. And the color movie gives you some visuals to see what they were talking about. And you got a total of 8 witnesses that were involved in this thing. So you have a lot of evidence, and I managed to create a complete history of the subject of this particular case, and concluded that they saw apparently several lighted objects doing something out there that should not have been there. And this was publicly announced in March of 1979 at a press conference in New York City. It merited a small column in the New York Times, and I was on Good Morning America to discuss it. But the arguments over the technicalities and so on continued for years afterwards. But it was because I was able to take a frame of this film and calculate brightness of the object. I then set that brightness calculation into this journal called Applied Optics. And that prompted some skeptics to write a rebuttal, and then I published a rebuttal to the rebuttal. This is the only sighting that I'm aware of that has actually been argued about on technical points in a refereed technical journal. And oddly enough, in the most recent paper, the Inflation Theory Implications for ET Visitation, the only sighting that the referee allowed, that is the editor, we had a list of sightings that people could use as references in that article. The only one that he allowed to be in there, though, was the one on New Zealand, probably because it had this applied optics references that were, you know, an acceptable conventional journal. The New Zealand case proved to me that there was something out there, and that you could actually get some hard photographic type of evidence on it. A number of years later, you asked about the Gulf Breeze situation, and of course that was even more complicated because it lasted over years. Although the main witness, Ed Walters in Gulf Breeze, was a main witness for part of it, for the first couple of years. But there were so many other witnesses down there to what things that happened that this became not just a story of Ed Walters. And in fact, I wrote an article entitled "Gulf Breeze Without Ed," which talked about all the other things that happened. And I had this big list, I don't know, over 100 events spread over several years that had nothing to do with this guy who had taken the photographs. And of course, he was widely criticized and claimed to be a hoaxer and so on, and that he was managed to convince the whole city of Gulf Breeze that they were all witnesses themselves. All sorts of they obeyed the first rule of debunking, which is any explanation is better than none. And then the second rule of debunking is if the first explanation doesn't seem to make any sense, then try another explanation. And the corollary to that, of course, is you keep trying other explanations until you wear out the people who are trying to claim that it was unexplainable. Well, the inflation theory article is sort of a breakthrough type of article in the sense that we got into a refereed journal, an article in which we proposed that investigation of UFO sightings could answer the question posed by Fermi's paradox. His paradoxical question was, where are they? And that was based on the idea that even back in 1950, people could argue that if there were intelligent race somewhere in this galaxy, over tens of millions of years, it could colonize the whole galaxy, and we would have evidence of visitation. So the implied solution back in those days was, we're alone, we're not getting visitation, therefore we're the only intelligent race, intelligent creatures in this whole galaxy and maybe in the whole universe. That was the accepted explanation or resolution of Fermi's paradox. But in this paper, we've argued that modern theory, on two fronts. One, modern theory in terms of generation of life and intelligent life, suggests that if you can find suitable planets out there, intelligent life will eventually arise on these suitable planets. And nowadays we are finding planets out there for the first time. Back in 1950 it was all speculation, but now we do know, we have confirmation that there are solar systems out there, and the only further step to go is to actually detect an Earth-like planet. That may still be a while off, but in any event, there are planets circulating around suns. So the probability of a planet being capable of supporting life is increasing now. So the exobiological aspect is that the probability of intelligent life out there has increased from beyond what it was in 1950. And the second thing is, in 1950, people argued, well, if there were intelligent life elsewhere, ILE, the intelligent life elsewhere would be isolated. It couldn't get here from there because it's too far. It takes too long to travel. That's not an argument based on physics. It's an argument based on sociology, if you wish. There may be ways of traveling faster than the speed of light so that, hey, they can get here from there. It doesn't mean that they're coming in 5 minutes or they're coming every hour or every day, but you know, they might be able to traverse huge distances in a period of weeks or months or something instead of spending hundreds or thousands of years. So they could be coming here. Based on that, we're saying Fermi's paradox is strengthened. If you ignore UFO sightings, the paradox is even stronger now than in 1950 because we have better reasons now to believe that the intelligent life from elsewhere could be coming here. And yet, if you ignore UFO sightings, the claim is that there's no evidence of it. Even the SETI people aren't finding any evidence. And they're just sitting there listening to radio signals. That doesn't even require that the ETs come from long distances. So the question then is, where are they? And that's an even stronger question than it was then. And our answer is, well, look at the UFO sightings. Maybe they provide the answer that they are here, and we've been ignoring it. Of course, this whole argument is based, it comes from the portion of society that's based on science, shall we say, and is ignorant of what the internal workings of the U.S. government and other governments may know about actual things like crashes and retrievals and so on. So if you totally ignore the UFO phenomenon, then you're stuck with the paradox. If you start bringing in the UFO phenomenon just as the sightings that people have, it makes some sense scientifically to say, well, if there were just one actual spacecraft represented in these millions of UFO sightings, then that would resolve the paradox, that we're not alone in the universe. So this paper tackles this theoretical aspect of the strengthening of Fermi's paradox, according to modern theories. And then it says, well, let's look at what happened with the UFO sightings and the U.S. Air Force and the CONDON study. And we find out that, well, they were not completely on the up and up. They were not exactly scientific things after all. The CONDON study left one-third of the sightings that they investigated, about 100 of them, they left one-third unidentified. The American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics in 1970 had a UFO panel which reviewed the CONDON study and said, hey, any scientific investigation that leaves one-third or even one-fifth or whatever of sightings unexplained is a good reason to continue the investigation, not shut it down. Well, of course, the U.S. Air Force used the CONDON study as a justification to shut the whole thing down, right? And when that happened, the general public and I guess the scientific community considered, well, it's all finished. You know, there were never were any UFO sightings that amounted to anything, and they're never going to happen again. Well, that was sort of the feeling in 1970, 71, and 72, and then in the summer of 1973, the UFO struck back with a major flap in the United States. Police sightings in Georgia and southeastern areas in the United States, and then numerous other states came in, and ever since then we've had sightings all over the world and so on. So what the paper basically says is the U.S. government, you can't rely on what the U.S. government claims. You can't rely on them to be correct when they say that there's nothing to UFO sightings. And then we point out in the paper that other governments have set up UFO investigating groups that exist even today. Whereas the United States government has no official group investigating sightings. You do have one in France, in Brazil, and Chile. Spanish government released a bunch of documents. I don't know if they have an investigating group. The British government has released a number of documents in recent years, the last couple of years, indicating that they had a research group back in the 50s that was sort of trying to pan the whole subject. But I don't think they have an official UFO government group now. China has a major organization that they claim 300 and some thousand members, and it's supported by the government. Of course, there are civilian investigating groups all over the place. But as far as this paper is concerned, what we demonstrated was that the claim of the U.S. government that there was nothing there isn't right. And there's a lot of information that has happened. Most people think that the CONDON study, which was completed in 1968, was the be-all and end-all of everything. That's what, if you write to the U.S. government and ask for a reference that talks about UFOs and what they could be, they will refer you to the CONDON study. A lot of information has come out since the CONDON study that was not available, including information from U.S. government intelligence agencies. Stuff that the CONDON people were not aware of, the few people were aware of. The FBI in 1977 released 1,600 pages of stuff that they had collected. The CIA released 980 pages in 1978. Other government agencies over the years. And then the Air Force Intelligence released documents in 1985, and people are still looking through intelligence documents that go back into the 40s and 50s. So we're saying that you can't use the previous studies like the CONDON study to prove that UFOs have nothing to do with extraterrestrials, because their studies were flawed. So you should spend some time looking at the good cases and find out, is there something here that can't be explained? Well, I have, believe it or not, tried to keep a low profile at work. And the only thing that I've been told by the people that I work for is leave us out of it. You do anything you want in your own time. I have a website, and if you go there on the front page, it lists a whole bunch of case investigations that I've done, including New Zealand that I mentioned and the McMinnville sightings. I also have published 2 books, one called the UFO FBI Connection, which covers everything everything that was going on but you didn't know about during the first 5 years of, mostly the first 5 years of the history of the subject, from 47 until the early 50s. That's when the FBI was collecting most of the information from the Air Force. The FBI was like a black hole. The Air Force would provide it with information and it would get stored. There are documents in the FBI file that talk about the Air Force in 1952, top Air Force officials seriously considering the interplanetary explanation. But you won't find that anywhere in the Air Force files. You only find it in the FBI. Because these were statements to an FBI agency, and then the agent goes back home and writes down everything he was told, and that gets stored in the FBI file. Headquarters FBI was directed by Congress never to throw away anything. So when I wrote in 1976 under the Freedom of Information Act for documents, if they had any documents, I didn't think they did. There wasn't any historical references indicating the FBI had ever been involved in the UFO subject. And lo and behold, I get a phone call from an FBI guy who was handling the FOIA request, and he says, "Why, there's 1,600 pages of stuff here, This book is based on the FBI documents, a combination of FBI, Air Force intelligence documents that weren't released until 1985. The book was written in the middle 90s. So it has FBI, CIA, and Air Force documents, all put together. So I've written a history in that book that you could not have written 20 years ago. You couldn't have written it because the documents weren't available. So we can tell, we have a better idea what happened now than the people had back in the 1950s when it was actually happening. That's the UFO FBI connection. As I said, it's the FBI, Air Force Intelligence, and the CIA all combined together. The other book, called Abduction in My Life, is a novel with a fact book built inside. It's written in a way, I don't think there's any other book written like this one on the market, where the main character gets involved in the fiction story of somebody who's an abductee and trying to find out what's going on. But the main character decides he needs information on how he's going to handle this investigation. And so he goes to the library and he finds a book called What You Should Know About Unidentified Flying Objects. And he starts reading the book. And this is written in an expository, straightforward manner of a technical book that's built into the fiction. A fiction book is written like a story, you know. But you read this technical book right along with, complete with references. If you were to cut out the sections, cut the pages of this book, I mean the real book, you cut the pages out where it's got this inside fact book and paste them all together, and you've got a standalone library reference on the history of the UFO subject, how it began, the Air Force involvement, FBI files, CIA files, Air Force intelligence. It's all in there, and a whole bunch of different sightings, including New Zealand, for example, as examples of what happened. So when you finish reading this whole novel, you have an idea of how the abduction problem is being handled, what abductions are all about. But more than that, you've got a good grounding, as it were, in the factual part of this whole subject. So it's not a huge book, you know, it's not too hard to read. It's gotten good reviews from lots of people. Unfortunately, you can't categorize it as fiction, and you can't categorize it as fact. So I had a tough time finding a publisher because nobody wanted to take it on, you know, with this sort of a nebulous classification, which I call faction, F-A-C-T-I-O-N. It's a new form of literature. And as I said, after you get finished, you've had a good read. At the same time, you know something you didn't know before. And unlike novels, which often build real facts into the story, with a typical novel, unless you're an expert in the field that this novel is written about, you don't know what's factual and what isn't. So you have to assume that everything you read is fiction made up by the author. Well, in this situation, you don't have to there's no question about it. As I said, it's specifically called out. This part you're reading is factual, and here is the documentation. There's something like 50 or 60 references at the end of the book, which are the references in this fact book. Well, back in the late 70s, when the Freedom of Information Act was being used for the first time in the UFO area, I wrote to the U.S. Navy Freedom of Information Act office for any information they had, and I actually had a particular sighting that was found in the FBI file. The FBI file had been released by this time, and there was a very interesting Navy sighting in there, a sighting from Alaska that involved a typical patrol aircraft, a jet aircraft flying around Alaska that in the middle of the night there was some reddish light, you know, that was traveling around, and this jet tried to catch up with it. And according to the FBI collection of papers on that, this was a sighting by a Navy pilot, and some Navy group in Washington, D.C. had analyzed it. I didn't get anything on what I was looking for. Instead, I got documents that talked about photographic analysis by the Navy Photographic Interpretation Center, photographic analysis of a UFO movie that took place in Tremonton, Utah, which happened to be taken by a Navy photographer, and another film that came in 1950 in Great Falls, Montana. Those are two famous UFO movie films. And the Navy had spent a lot of time analyzing these two films back in 1952, and so I got some documentation on that. Like I said, he said he didn't find anything else on the subject that he could locate. So I suspect the Navy is deeply plugged in at a deep level. Yes, my own feeling is that the United States government, at least, is not going to say anything until it's absolutely proven, and then the government will say, oh yes, we knew it all along. Well, if we had a sighting could prove it, if something landed on the White House lawn, or during the Super Bowl, this big craft hovers over the stadium, or Doesn't have to be in the United States, someplace in the rest of the world where a sighting lasts long enough so there's a big congregation of news media and officials and so on, and everybody's saying that it's there, and it essentially gets impossible to deny that something actually happened. In Mexico, they've had a large number of sightings, and I think you find that in Mexico, there are a lot of people who think this is real. That hasn't made it into the United States yet, because the United States press doesn't really cover this subject, even in the United States, and totally ignores it with respect to outside the United States. I can't remember when there have been some numbers, a handful of sightings from other countries. But I should mention that, for example, in the Mexico case of last year, 5th of March, 2004, because it was released by the Mexican Department of Defense, that did get press coverage everywhere, and a lot of coverage in the United States. Had the Defense Department said something more about their own investigation, you see, they handed it to this guy, to Jaime Maussan, right? And he was known to be a UFO investigator, or interested in the UFO subject. And the Defense Department simply said, we don't know what this is, you look at it. And so it was portrayed as being, you know, well, UFOs because they gave it to Jaime Maussan. Had the Mexican Department of Defense said, well, we analyzed this and we proved that it couldn't be explained, then there would have been even wider interest and probably a big reaction on the part of the U.S. government. They might have gone down and attacked Mexico or something, I don't know. Well, the U.S. press can probably get away with ignoring almost anything that happens in another country because there won't be that much direct connection. Of course, the internet makes it tougher nowadays, I suppose. But the Mexican press hasn't disenfranchised all those people. They report these things down in Mexico. But it just doesn't make it into the United States. And I think that's partially because of the history of the subject. The U.S. government has poo-pooed it for years. The U.S. press has essentially gone along with it, making it, ridiculing witnesses whenever possible. And for the press to reverse its position would look bad for them. I mean, if the New York Times were suddenly to publish an article saying, well, we've been wrong all these years, UFOs are real and here's the proof, there'd be a tremendous mea culpa on the part of the press, my mistake. Oh well, what do we do from now? But I think it's largely the press feels that it would get into trouble with the United States government. It feels that it would be criticized. It itself would be ridiculed for taking the subject seriously. Anyone who studies this realizes that in the United States, 99% of the press reportage on UFOs is presented as entertainment. You don't find UFO stories on the front page. You find it in the entertainment section. Now, the Mexican government release last year was a little bit different. That did get onto some front pages, but that was because it was an official release by the government itself. Had it just been citizens who happened to have a forward-looking infrared system that was picking up these lights or whatever, probably never would have heard of it. Well, I don't think we can force the mainstream to look at it. You mean the mainstream press or the mainstream scientific community? Well, we're chipping away at it all the time. More and more people are coming over to our side, but we're still chipping away at a big stone. We haven't cracked the whole rock yet. Continual chipping away, though, is known to wear things down, And I've often felt that as soon as the 50% or more of the population becomes witnesses, then all of a sudden someone will stand up and say, look, they're real. It's sort of the emperor has no clothes effect. Everybody will say, oh yeah, we knew that all along. We just didn't believe our own eyes. But we also have to break through what I call a self-cover-up. Everybody is probably guilty of not accepting this to some extent because who wants to know it's real? One press guy that we talked to many, many years ago said, I can't write a story on this. it's too big, and it has, the implications are tremendous, you know, for religion, philosophy, politics, war, anti-war, you name it. Everything's going to be impacted by saying that, well, there are creatures flying around out there, we don't know what they're doing, or maybe we do know what they're doing, and there's nothing we can do about it, whether we know what they're doing or not. So there's a self-cover-up aspect that, well, it may be fine for them to be out there. When you bring in abductions and so on, this gets awfully close to home, and nobody really wants to think about all that stuff. So until you can break through the self-cover-up, and I think every person that's in the press is subjected to the he's a person, subjected to this self-cover-up feeling, plus the fact that he knows if he writes an article, he's likely to be criticized or you know, lose some credibility. It's like the aircraft pilots. Aircraft pilots initially reported sightings, and then they realized that, well, if they report a sighting, they're likely to get this big psychological evaluation and then told they're going to fly a desk for a few years. A sighting in 1986 that involved a Japanese jumbo jet over Alaska. This is all on my website. The pilot of that craft was grounded for several years afterwards, even though he did nothing wrong except report this event. And it was hard for him to avoid reporting it because at the time it occurred, he was in contact with the Air Traffic Control Center at Anchorage Air Force Base, and they were picking up some stuff on radar too. So that's the situation. If people in some field of endeavor, like newspaper reporters or pilots, feel that they're going to be disparaged for making some sort of a report, they're not going to make the report. Well, I can't cite any specific case that I know of recently. I'm not aware of any big pilot sighting similar to that. That particular sighting made international news, and so the pilot got an awful lot of publicity out of it that he probably didn't want, and he ended up being grounded for a while. Some other governments have set up UFO investigating groups, like down in Chile, for example. As a matter of fact, I spoke there. So not every government is taking the attitude, the hard-nosed attitude that the United States is taking. But whether it's collusion between governments or not, I don't know.